Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kutan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with the National Worry Index. It's the first of its kind index. It was released by MA Research today, and it gauges how worried people are at the national level. So apparently, Malaysians' worry levels, it turns out, is at maximum. Now, four things weigh heavily on Malaysians' minds: the high cost of living, jobs, the economy, and security. Are you worried that Malaysians are a worrying lot, Sharaad?
Well, I must say that, at the end of the day, whether we're warriors or warriors,
Warriors or warriors? Warriors? I prefer the warriors.
The question is what we do with that warrior. Concerns are genuine, and I think ultimately, what you want the story to be, the conversation to be, is to take that concern. So their signal to the government that they're concerned about the economy writ large, they're talking about jobs, people are concerned about the cost of living. All those four items seem to be obviously tied or related to each other. But in many respects, the larger solutions, or the solutions, the long-term solutions, perhaps require us to think about the kind of trade-offs and the kinds of pains that we must embrace in the short term in order to achieve long-term benefits. So I think the conversation only begins with surveys like this. It doesn't end with them.
Of course, and I'm really hoping that policymakers, politicians, people in power pay attention to this, because what we can see is, I think last year, just before GE14, one of the top concerns was to do with corruption, with abuse of power, misuse of public funds. Now corruption and abuse of power place 6 in terms of Malaysians' list of worries. What we are worried about is, job security, about youth unemployment, about the loss of income due to being fired and so on. So clearly, the man behind MA Research, as we know, Rais Hussein, was on the show recently, and he talked about the perut economy, right? So essentially, it's the bread and butter issues that we are worried about, and it would, I guess, will go miles for the people in power in Putrajaya to pay attention to the fact that these are the list of concerns that Malaysians have.
Right, because Rais Hussein has been quite critical of the present administration, saying that they've forgotten what they already knew intuitively. So maybe lending some numbers, some more granularity to the question of the perut economy is what was the aim of this particular, exercise. I do think, however, is what you do need is some sort of disaggregation of the big numbers, right? So you have the large numbers. What you need to know is to say, where is it most acute? What is it that people think would help solve their problems? And finding a narrative that actually resonates with people. And I think that's something that's been said over and over again. This present government has failed to do because they don't have a communications strategy.
Sure. Very quickly, I want to ask you, Sharaad, do you think that, policy decisions or policy making should be driven by surveys like this? Because, the populist worry will always be to do with wallets, heart, or brain, right?
Okay, yeah, that might be. I mean, but you do want policy to be driven by evidence. And surveys like this are part of the evidence base that you want to do, on which to pin your policy. So I can't see any harm in taking these things seriously. You might want to look at the methodology. You might question some of the assumptions of a survey. Right. But at the end of the day, is government doing as much to discover what Malaysians are concerned about, and are they acting in it in a way that both deals with the short term as well to the long term and the medium term kind of time frames?
All right, well, let's turn our attention now to the debate that was ignited following news that the ashes of former Communist Party of Malaya Secretary General Jinpings were brought back to Malaysia and scattered in the jungles and seas near Lumut, which is his hometown. What do you make of this, of the debate surrounding this, Sharaad?
Well, Melissa, this is one of those debates that we've come to in substance rather than form over and over again, which is the historical role of the Communist Party of Malaya and the individuals involved in it, and how do we look at that particular history? So every time a Communist Party of Malaya type of issue arises, and it's arisen every 1.5 years, I think it's kind of a cycle, we have the same sort of vitriol being spilled and emotive arguments, I think, used in order to generate a kind of blinding effect, I think, on the public discourse. We've had the Prime Minister, the former IGP, Noor, who was instrumental in the peace treaty. Now, there's something
Yes.
that's often forgotten. The peace treaty that actually laid out the terms for the armistice, or rather the laying down of arms between the communist insurgents and the government of Malaysia, included the return of many of its top-ranking members. Now, many return, and some of them, in fact, went on to have careers in a modern Malaysia, but Jinping was denied the right to return. Now, some people are making a fuss about the ashes. Rahim Noor seems to have no problems, and Mahathir rather mockingly say, what do you want us to do? Collect up the ashes and return them?
Yeah, I think there's no going back from this. Of course, bringing his ashes back home isn't the same as attempting to revive the Communist Party, but we will keep a close eye on how this conversation evolves. I do want to take a look at some other news. Now, we have an interesting piece of news. The Public Accounts Committee has called for an audit on the 20 million ringgit in public funds invested into Aerodyne Ventures, which is the private firm behind the flying car project. So this is to scrutinize if the funds had been used for the project. So the Entrepreneur Development Minister, Muhammad Rizwan Yusof, had previously told Parliament that no tax money would be involved in the building of the prototype for the flying car. But the PAC has found that 20 million ringgit had been channeled to Aerodyne through a company called Venture Tech, which is a subsidiary of MITE, which is also under the Prime Minister's department. So clearly, public funds being used.
Well, okay, so this is fascinating because, you know, Mohammad Ridwan is probably one of the most mocked politicians in the cabinet at this point in time. Much of it because of the way he's characterized this project as a national project, so on and so forth. All of the claims of which have seemed to have fallen by the wayside as deeper scrutiny into the project took place. And so the question is, what is this minister up to now? Not to cast aspersions or to suggest, you know, that any kind of wrongdoing is done. But clearly the Public Accounts Committee is doing their job. Yeah. They are investigating something that doesn't look right. And, you know, it's a good sign. This is a sign that the new Malaysia, you know, in the new Malaysia, we're not going to have the kind of opaque governance that allows all kinds of nonsense to get done.
I absolutely agree. I think this is a good thing. So the PAC report that was released today on the flying car project, I thought it was particularly interesting. I'm going to read to you some of the things that I found interesting. Funding, of course, one of the many concerns the PAC had about the project, but also the PAC noted that Rizwan's public announcement about the flying car back in February, it was done without any prior presentations to Cabinet. No detailed planning or due diligence was done on Aerodyne's financial and technical capabilities. The other thing that was interesting was that Rizwan had misrepresented the flying car project as a national initiative when in fact the PAC had found that the project is a private initiative and that Aerodyne, as claimed by Rizwan, would be using local technology. The PAC found that the prototype is being built in Japan.
Now, because one of the big things is, and I think this is a story that needs to get some attention for the Public Accounts Committee. Remember in the bipartisan national period, the Public Accounts Committee actually attempted to look into 1MDB, right? And that was scuttled by all kinds of clever maneuvering by the then Prime Minister Najib Razak. Now, the PAC of today comprises both, and is led by somebody from the opposition benches, but of course comprises many members of the government, including
a bipartisan
It's a
endeavor.
bipartisan effort. It's very important because bipartisan efforts give balance and potentially allow nobody to hide misdoings. Now, Nurul Izzah is from the government side in this, Wong Chen, Stephen Chong from Terbau. Also, we have Akmal Nasrullah Mohammad Nasir there. Some other names from that side. Also, on the side of the MPs, we have from PAS, we have Taqiyuddin Hassan, one of the bigger names. Also, somebody from Sarawak, we have Robert Lawson Chwat. Now, again, the success of this will be in calling out what is going on. Importantly is, what is the cabinet going to do? What is the Prime Minister going to do when the final report is actually exposed.
Yeah, so the PAC now recommending that Rizwan's ministry prepare a detailed paper and present that to the cabinet. I'm going to be curious to see the reaction to that from cabinet.
I'm looking for the memes to come out. I'm just waiting for the memes.
All right,
Bring on the memes.
We're going to take a closer look at the missing MPs in Parliament. So make sure you stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Hello, welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on MP absenteeism in Parliament lately, along with photos of empty chambers and a lack of quorum in the House. Now, this begs the question, is attendance by ministers, their deputies and backbenchers compulsory when Dewan Rakyat is in session? To discuss this further, we have joining us on the line Fahmi Fazil, MP of Lembah Pantai and PKR Communications Director. Fahmi, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, I'd like to ask you, those headlines that we've been seeing, the memes on social media, are they fair or are they misleading? Are they fair to say, to question, where are the MPs in Parliament?
I think it's always good to know where your MP is. I think in Malaysia, our perception of MPs is that they are supposed to be able to solve all of our problems. And oftentimes in places like Kuala Lumpur, an MP is expected to function not only as a member of parliament, but also as a state assembly person and a local councillor, looking after everything from national issues to very, very hyper-local issues like drains and trees, for example. So it's always good to know where your hard-earned tax ringgit is going. And I think in that sense, it would be good to know the performance of your member of parliament in parliament itself, because we are elected to be representing the voice of the rakyat, the voice of the voters in parliament.
I mean, Fahmi, it seems to me that, underlying that description was the real problem with our governance structure, which is that in many ways the public doesn't quite understand the specific role of MPs as lawmakers, and they have projected all kinds of other demands, and therefore their ability to focus on lawmaking, which would presumably demand that they stay in Parliament for these sessions, is compromised. Are you saying that part of the problem is, in fact, a lack of understanding on the part of the public?
Yeah, I think democracy literacy is one way of putting it. I think we still have some way to go in Malaysia. Oftentimes, I think people expect in a lot of places, a member of parliament is meant to almost become like the person that you go to when you have an emergency. A lot of my colleagues who come from rural areas often tell me how, in the middle of the night, people come to their doors when they have a child to be delivered, asking for help from a member of parliament. But at the same time, I think a lot of members of parliament also don't discourage this perception. So it is something that is quite cyclical, and it builds on itself. Unfortunately, I think it obfuscates what the actual view should be about what a lawmaker really needs to be doing.
Okay, so Fahmi, having said that, are you saying that because of all the duties of an MP, that it would be unrealistic to expect an MP to be sat in Parliament the whole day?
I go into Parliament at 10 today, and I left when it ended. But even between then, because during lunch break, I didn't have lunch. I went to 2 programs in my constituency. It happens to be 5 minutes away, but I'm quite lucky. For a lot of MPs who are from out of town, who are not based in Kuala Lumpur, constituencies in rural areas, of course, they won't be able to go back. So usually what happens in a day, an MP is supposed to clock in at 10. That's when the sessions begin. And oftentimes, we would have the sessions go on until about 1, and then we have a break to 2:30. But break doesn't mean rest. Usually we have meetings, we have briefing sessions, we have questions and answers with ministers, with ministry reps, sometimes with NGOs, and caucus meetings. And now in this parliament, we have innovated. We have added a new thing called parliamentary special select committees. So for example, I sit in one on human rights and gender equality. So there's 6 new ones, and I think we've also announced a couple of weeks ago several other new ones. So technically, one of the most active select committees, of course, is the PAC, the Public Accounts Committee, but also the Budget Committee has been quite active, and recently we've seen how, with regards to the IPCMC bill, the Bills Consideration Select Committee has been very active. So,
I mean, all these very valid points, Fahmi. So clearly, I mean, MPs have a very busy day. I just want to make sense of the headlines that have come out recently. You know, comments that the chamber is, you know, very cold. It is notoriously cold, but the idea that it's too cold for MPs to be in Parliament all day. The comments saying that perhaps MPs are, you know, too exhausted. Exhaustion is one of the reasons why perhaps MPs are not in the hall.
I mean, Fahmi, is there a thermostat in Parliament?
It is notoriously
simple question.
cold.
Is there a thermostat that's working?
no, this is actually, I have raised this matter before, that Parliament actually is quite cold. People who come in wearing batik shirts, you know, oftentimes they find that they complain. Visitors, you know, when I meet them, sometimes they complain it's a bit cold. And for MPs, we're wearing suits. And you think about it, you know, Malaysia is a tropical country, and yet members of Parliament are expected to wear suits to Parliament. So it's not really about Parliament, the nature of Parliament, but it's really about how we manage buildings. You go to a lot of buildings, you know, you go to the cinema, you have to bring a sweater sometimes. So it's the same thing. Sometimes we overcompensate for the mugginess of being in the equator.
Surely this is a simple question of going up to whoever controls the thermostat and actually getting them to readjust it. But I do want to get back to some other, I think, genuine concerns, which is that, okay, and you were going to educate people about the image of an empty assembly. When should Parliament and those seats be filled? Is it when a vote is taken? Is it when debates are happening? Because, you know, I mean, when is it that image would be wrong, and when would it be actually just a very convenient way for the media to attack parliamentarians?
According to the Parliament standing orders, we need to have at any one time a minimum of 26 MPs so that we have sufficient quorum to continue with the business in the House. We can't expect all 222 MPs to be there all the time. The Prime Minister, especially, you know, ministers, they have official functions and official duties, and they have to run government. But for backbench, oftentimes we're expected to be there. But even then, we would be having meetings, we would be sitting in committees, we would be meeting with NGOs, you know, to assess how they feel about certain bill. People come and talk to us about whether they agree or disagree with a certain bill that's going to come up. You know, we've had people come and talk to us about vaping, for example. We've had, you know, I had people come and talk to me about mental health issues. So it's not like we're just, you know, sitting around shaking our legs.
Right.
Well,
but
actually, I want to ask you this, because, you know, in some ways the public expectation is that you're present in the hall, but it's no guarantee, it seems to me, that just because an MP is present that they're actually thinking about the issues, or that even when they speak, that their contributions of any quality. Have we missed the real issue here? Is it about attendance, or is it about the quality of engagement?
It's really about the lawmaking process. One of the biggest reforms that we need to do actually is to do, in my personal opinion, is to do away with the House sitting in its entirety as a committee. You go to pass a bill, you have to have what they call 3 readings. After the second reading, when we do our policy stage debates, where everyone can talk about almost anything, philosophical or something that is specific about the issue, then it goes to committee stage. The committee stage in a lot of other jurisdictions means a group of people who sit down, just like the bill consideration committee.
Right.
So they actually can gather expert advice, and people can come and confer, and that is supposed to be how a bill is to be made. I think we are moving in the right direction. It will take a long time. Westminster took 400 years to change. So I think in Malaysia, after 2 years, we're seeing some very positive progress.
So let me just get this right, Fahmi. You're saying that the way to make this a more efficient system is to have more select committees. So having special committees within Dewan Rakyat to look at specific issues. So smaller, not too many members, so that can free up the time and space for MPs to do other things which they were voted in for. Is that right?
Yes, I think that would be a better use of the Rakyat's ringgit. And to me, it would actually make a lot of the lawmaking more precise. The thing is that when we debate, oftentimes the younger MPs, especially in the new cohort, are usually able to furnish data, statistics, and sometimes the debates can be very emotive or emotional. And I think that can distract from what actually is happening on the ground. The biggest fear as a lawmaker for me, and why I think I don't discourage meeting and dealing with problems on the ground and seeing for myself, is that that's a way to see whether the laws that we pass are actually implemented well on the ground. So you know that if you have a high incident of a particular thing, whereas you know that the law says that this matter should have been resolved, then there's something wrong with the law. And this gap, this juncture, it can only be filled when an MP is aware of the process of making a law to make that law more robust and more efficient and effective, as well as what's actually happening on the ground, in the field. So I think an MP, you can't run away from us, sometimes not being in, I'm not saying, I'm apologizing for people who don't make it there. I haven't missed a single day of this session of Parliament so far, and I'm there from 10 to 10 usually.
And you're also doing a count. So if you follow Fahmi on his Twitter,
yes,
he will tell you the account.
He's taking attendance, and that's why we're calling you tonight, Fahmi. Thank you so much
the class monitor.
Thank you for joining us on the show. We'll be right back on Consider This. Don't go anywhere. Thanks for staying with us on Consider This. Here's what we want you to consider tonight. So the Transport Ministry today has said it would exempt large families from installing child restraint seats in their vehicles. Now, this is in acknowledging that the directive would be more difficult and costly for large families to implement.
Okay, so it's great for these large families, perhaps also large families who are from the working class, to cope with a ruling that is going to put a huge burden on their finances. But the cost is now being paid by the child. So the child's safety is compromised. Admittedly, I grew up in a time when, child restraint seats weren't compulsory. I don't think they even existed. And I seem to have survived. But the question is this: today, when the norm is in fact child safety seats, the child comes from the big family, is deprived of that extra protection that is afforded to those other kids.
I had to restrain myself from saying, okay, boomer there, but that's all right. No, I completely understand. I'm just wondering in whether, it's a really delicate balance here, because the government has a duty to regulate this, to ensure the safety, especially of minors, of children, but at the same time acknowledging that, this is a real concern. Families with lots of children perhaps cannot afford this. And if you think about it, right, one car can only fit 2 child safety seats. What if you have more than 2 children? What if you have another adult that requires use of that car as well? You have more than 2 adults. So I think there's a really delicate balance, and I'm wondering what the trade-off is, whether we're trading off one for another, safety over convenience.
Yeah. I think it's less a question of convenience. It's a question of the ability to implement these things in a way. So the one solution possibly is for government to subsidize these large families and
subsidize seats. You mean?
Yes, subsidize the purchase of seats.
What about subsidize purchase of big cars? Because if you have 4 children, you're going to need a bigger car.
And so this is where you'll see everybody up in arms and saying, why should everybody else pay for your personal decision to have more children? If you decided to have a huge family, then you should have been prepared to deal with the consequences, the financial consequences of that. Now, this is a difficult question. I don't know what the solution is.
I have to wonder, you know, I mean, large families, what options do they have? Do they have the option of public transport? Often large families are from the lower to middle income bracket, and that means that it would be more difficult for them to buy bigger cars, to get more child seat, and whether they even have the option of public transport or, you know, sending their children off with another vehicle.
Yeah, and there's also this question of the difference between the middle classes of, you know, cities versus rural populations, and what are the kind of options that are available there. It's a huge problem when it comes to policy making. Do you make one policy for the entire nation, or do you devolve policy to local administrative regions so that you can take into account the specificities of that locality and create policy accordingly?
There you go. Something for you to consider tonight. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have on the show. We will be back for another episode of Consider This, same time tomorrow. But for tonight, I'm Melisa Idris with me, Sharaad Kutan, signing off. Thank you for watching.